presentation is brought to us by the future Dr. Lawrence Locklear in the very near future. Who is now APD? Almost there, okay. So he's well on his way. Currently, he is the program coordinator for the Southeast American Indian Studies here at UNCP. He is pursuing his PhD in Educational Studies with a concentration in higher education at UNCG, and he earned his master's here. Lawrence is an avid genealogist, a researcher. He has great information. Not too shabby, he is also the author of Hail to UNCP, which we also have the bookstore. So please welcome, we'll go ahead and say it, Dr. Lawrence Locklear.
Thank you, Nancy, for those kind words. I think I could get used to hehearing Dr. Locklear. I like the way that sounds. Yeah, it's a good sound, the way it rolls off your tongue. So don't even. There you go. There you go. But I'm very excited to be here today to talk about Lumbees and talk about genealogy. These are two of my favorite subjects. But I want to start off by introducing myself. As Lumbees do, we always ask who's your people. My parents are Merle Locklear and Mary Ann Strickland. My dad is from the Union Chapel community. His parents were John Archie and Roberta Locklear. They lived right there near the schoolhouse at Union Chapel. My mom's parents were Jeffrey Strickland and Pearl Strickland, and they lived right here in the St. Anna community, right north of Pembroke. So my ties are very deep in those two communities, and I call both of them home. My research, I've done a lot of research into my family's history. The names that I've researched include the Locklears, Stricklands, Jacobs, Jones, Lowrys, Maynards, Chavises, Brayboys, Brooks, Cummings. You name them, that probably just covers just about everybody in here. So, like I said, we're all related. But I've also researched the Locklears. My dad's father, John Archie Locklear, he was born in Marlborough County, and so he's from the Locklear set that's down around Clio in Marlborough. So have some ties there. But in talking about my topic today, I was raised by my mother's grandparents, and so you can imagine as a child, especially during family get-togethers, there was a lot of time spent talking about our elders and our family history. And I heard my granddad talk many times about his family and some of their stories, and some of those included his father walking the railroad track from Pembroke to Claxton, Georgia to work in the turpentine industry. He mentioned that many times. Also, stories about his paternal grandfather losing his leg while he was working at Fort Fisher at the start of the Civil War. So the little vignettes like that were repeated over and over and over again in our family. And but one that he told that really stuck with me was related to his grandmother, which would have been my great-great-grandmother. Her name was Rosalie Locklear Jones. She was born in 1878, they died in 1958. She also lived in the St. Anna community. She was married to William Jones. Zilly was a colorful character in our family's history. Wish I had more time to tell you about her. But she lots of times told her grandchildren this story, and this is a quote that was given to me by my grandfather. He said, in speaking of talking of her parents, she said, "While going to Tennessee in a wagon, they were so high up on the mountains that the clouds came down and they were able to wash their hands in the clouds." That was a story that she told many times, and my grandfather repeated it, his siblings repeated it, and for a long time, my grandfather and his siblings, they assumed that Zillie's family was from Tennessee. They just didn't know. They didn't know who her parents were, didn't know where she came from. And so with me, that left me very curious. Like, okay, so who is this lady? Where are folks from? Were they Lumbee? Were they originally from Tennessee? I mean, just who was she? And so I soon set out on this journey to learn more about my family's history, but also how to connect that history to historical records in a way that I could learn more about my great-great-grandmother and her parents. And so we'll come back to Zillie in a second. But today we're going to talk about a couple different areas. One is talk briefly about what's the difference between oral history and an oral tradition. We're also going to discuss why our oral history is important. Also, how do genealogists connect oral histories to the historical record. And I'm hoping, if we have time left, that some of you in the audience can share some of your family's oral histories with us today, because I think every family has some great stories to tell, and I think they're just waiting there for other people to hear about them. But the first question I'll ask you guys, and I would appreciate some audience feedback on this, is what do you think is the difference between oral history and oral tradition? If you had to tell someone, what would you think the difference would be? Because I think sometimes those words get used interchangeably. What do you think the difference is?
Something that really happened.
What was that again?
Something that really happened at the time, and they pass it down telling it. Then traditions are just things that they do, the oral, traditionally, this is what we used to do back then or whatever, and they just pass it down and continue to do it.
Okay. Anybody else?
Would oral history be written?
Okay.
You write it down as someone.
It could be at some point in time. Starts off as oral history. Yes, it could definitely be recorded. Yes.
I think oral history would maybe be a recollection of an event or events versus tradition is much more of a thing that maybe is still done.
Okay.
So you're passing down, well, this is what they did, this is how we're still going to do it. Canon is oral tradition. Okay. Oral history would be telling where we come from. We don't still physically come from Virginia anymore. That's
right.
where we came from at one point in time. That's an event that happened, us coming down here. So,
So it seems like y'all have a pretty good grasp of this. There's a Dakota scholar. Her Dakota name is, and I hope I can pronounce this correctly, is Wazia Tawin. She's formerly known as Angela Wilson. She attempted to define the terms oral history and oral traditions, but from a native perspective. She discovered that most scholars in the field of history, which is what she got her PhD in, they believed that oral history refers to the study of the recent past by means of life histories or personal recollections, where informants speak about their own experiences. In addition, oral tradition should be widely practiced or understood in a society, and it must be handed down for at least a few generations. That's what the historians thought. Well, she found this to be problematic because Native people's life histories often incorporate the experiences of both human and non-human beings. In addition, the historian's definition would not allow for the incorporation of new materials because it would then be outside the tradition. So she suggested, from a Native perspective, that oral history is contained within oral tradition. For the Dakota, oral tradition refers to the way in which the information is passed on rather than the length of time something has been told. Personal experiences, pieces of information, events, incidents can become part of the oral tradition at the moment it happens or the moment it is told, as long as the person adapting the memory is part of an oral tradition. And a perfect example of this is Charles Eastman. He was also Dakota. His autobiography was called Indian Boyhood. Some of you may have read it before, but it talked about a distinct way in which oral tradition was developed. And he said the following, and this is a quote from him. He said, "Very early, the Indian boy assumed the task of preserving and transmitting the legends of his ancestors and his race. Almost every evening, a myth or a true story of some deed done in the past was narrated by one of the parents or grandparents, while the boy listened with parted lips and glistening eyes. On the following evening, he was usually required to repeat it. If he was not an apt scholar, he struggled long with this task. But as a rule, the Indian boy is a good listener and he has a good memory, so that his stories are tolerably well mastered. The household became his audience, by which he was alternately criticized and applauded." So this excerpt highlights the rigorous and extensive training required of young Dakota people. The Dakota oral tradition assumes that the ability to remember is an acquired skill, one that may be acutely developed or neglected. And so, speaking of those, so then I want to ask you this question: why do you think oral histories then are so important, especially to Lumbee people? Why do you think they're so important?
Well, especially like with me thinking in context of my family, and I think this is the case for most families here, for most of our history, we didn't write things down. We were considered illiterate because we didn't write, although I think that using the term illiterate to apply to our people it carries negative connotation, because the wider public assumes, well, if you can't write, then you're you're uneducated, you're less, you have less mental aptitude. But the fact of the matter is that as Indian people, we learn differently, we transmit information differently, and as we have done all throughout our history. So this oral history is something that resonates with us on a deep level because it's something our ancestors have always done. And that's the reason why we have a shared cultural memory. And they kind of spoke to it yesterday. There's a big story, and everyone sitting in this room and everyone in our communities has just a little piece of it. And when we come together at things like this, we put the oral history together when we share all the pieces. So I think the oral history is important because it's the fabric by which we're all connected.
Thank you. There's excellent points. Anybody want to add anything else?
Well, it's because others have always told our story or defined us. Yeah, we have to transmit it.
Yep, we have to tell our own stories. Exactly right. Anyone else?
I think too, Lawrence, for the Lumbee people, it's how we maintained our identity as Indian people. That's something our ancestors, if they had wanted to, they could have just let that been lost. They kept things apart, and the stories were what they did. It maintained our Indian identity.
Exactly right. Anyone else?
How about a collared sandwich and a chicken pastry? If the Lowrys hadn't and the Locklears hadn't passed that down, we'd be missing quite a bit.
I mean, how incomplete would our lives be if we didn't have a collared sandwich?
Just talk about food. You got it made. You got history and tradition.
Yep, so you got a little bit of everything. So you guys are exactly right. You hit the nail on the head. The Dakota scholar I was mentioning earlier, she suggested that these oral histories, the thing that's so important about them is they contribute details not seen elsewhere. And when she's talking about this, she's talking about histories that aren't recorded in any books anywhere. It's like you were talking about, we're oral people. We transmit our history orally. I mean, that's the way our people have been since time immemorial. So there's details and facts in those oral histories that you will not get anywhere else. And so this is very true, especially for the Lumbee people who were historically marginalized and historical footnotes until the Lowry War. There were not many references to us in the history books until we started shooting hot lead at some people in the 1860s. And it's like McKee Evans said, the Spencer rifles that the Lowry gang used did more to change minds about Indians in Robson County among whites than anything else did. So when that happened, we magically appeared in the history books. Okay, but we've always been there. We've always been here. Our oral histories have said that. So in addition, because these stories are typically not told in the history text, we must also recognize we are responsible for their repetition. I think this is one key to that is the written archival record will not produce this information. Consequently, these are not merely interesting stories or even the simple dissemination of historical facts. There are more importantly transmissions of culture that you mentioned earlier. You mentioned, Kenny, upon which our survival as a people depends. And so she said, when our stories die, so will we. So it's very important that we keep repeating these stories so that we'll live on forever. And so she also summed up the importance of oral histories when she wrote the following. This was a description of her talking to her grandmother, and I thought it was a really beautiful piece, and so I'm going to read it to you. It's real short. She said, "The intimate hours I spent with my grandmother listening to her stories are reflections of more than a simple educational process. The stories handed down from grandmother to granddaughter are rooted in a deep sense of kinship responsibility, a responsibility that relies on culture and identity and a sense of belonging essential to my life. It is through the stories of my grandmother, my grandmother's grandmother, and my grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, and their lives that I learned what it means to be a Dakota woman, and the responsibility, pain, and pride associated with such a role. These stories in our oral tradition then must be appreciated by historians not simply for their illumination they bring to the broader historical picture, but also an essential component in the survival of culture." And so she continued to say, "The contributions of oral history should be recognized as celebrations of culture as declarations of the amazing resiliency and tenacity of a people who have survived horrible circumstances and destructive forces. She's writing about her Dakota people, but that's also telling the story of the Lumbee people ourselves, so it just describes our experience. And so, so from personal experience, I just want to kind of give you guys a few short ways that as genealogists we can connect oral histories to the historical record. And so a couple of those, one I think is to be persistent and resilient. You know, a lot of times when you're doing research, you run into roadblocks. And so that doesn't mean you stop, it just means you back up and you find another door to go through. And so I ran into many of those during my research and still continue to run into those. And so you just kind of have to find other ways around that door. You may have to go around it, under it, over it, you'll find some way. But be persistent and resilient. Also, be organized, and I think everyone here is genealogists, you're organized. You have a binder, you have some way of keeping your records. Just be organized, it helps you stay better, helps you keep everything organized. But also, when you're interviewing someone or recording a family history, be sure to record it, like with your cell phone or some piece of instrument, something that's not too obtrusive, because you don't want to sit this huge recorder down in front of someone and say, hey, tell me your story. Because guess what? Their mind's going to go to that instrument and not the story that they need to be telling. So something small like a cell phone would be perfect. Make notes from the story. Be sure to include who is telling the story, any little details, because if you're like me and you start trusting things to memory, guess what? 5, 10, 15 minutes, an hour, 2 or 3 days later, 5 years later, when you find those notes, if you don't write it down, guess what? It's gone forever, because the person that you may have interviewed may have passed on by that time. So just try and keep notes like that. Also, when you're collecting oral histories, interview family members as well as non-family members. I found out in talking and learning about my family that there were non-family members that knew as much about some of my family members as family members did. So broaden your scope of folks that you want to interview. Also, when you're interviewing folks, record information about the person that you're interviewing and also the context around the story. Because like I said, 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, you may find this document, or family member a generation or two from now may find this document, and if you don't leave adequate details explaining the situation, they're not going to know or make that connection, so it's important that you do that. Also, I learned, bring a gift with you when you come to interview someone. It could be something small, could be a bag of pecans, could be that collard sandwich we talked about earlier. Bring a gift. You know, our people always find different ways to say thank you. I remember as a child when my folks would give someone a ride into town, and they would always say, well, hey, let me give you a piece of money for taking me into town. So I think that's just a tradition of ours. So bring a gift. Also, bring, especially if you're interviewing an elder member of your family, bring another elder member of your family along and let them start a conversation. You kind of give them a couple talking points and then just let them talk, and you kind of sit back and observe and collect notes, because when folks are having conversations, I think details and memories come back easier versus if you're asking them questions. Well, tell me this, tell me this, tell me this, tell me this. Just let them talk and kind of let it flow a little bit. Also, record the oral history as it's told to you. Even if you know that some of the details might be incorrect, you can always make notes later on saying this is incorrect, but just record it as is, because you never know what gem may be hidden in that incorrect information. And also, don't interrupt. Kind of let the conversation flow. Let it be natural, as if you were sitting talking to a parent or grandparent. Just kind of make it casual and relaxed. Also, if you can, transcribe your interviews. I know that transcriptions can be very expensive, but if you can, do that. And probably one of the most important things is please make backup copies. It's like Heather said, give everybody a copy of your interviews, your documents, because you never know what may happen. Your house may burn down. You could unfortunately pass away. Just disseminate it, folks. Email it to yourself. Like I've emailed, I scanned most of my genealogy documents and I emailed them to myself. They're in my email, and the reason that's important is if my house were ever to burn down, I would have a copy of those records in my email account. And also makes it easier to share. Some other resources for making this connection include using Census Records, which everyone's done, newspapers. You know, how many of you know that we have an archive of the Robsonian here on campus that goes back to 1887, 1880s? It's accessible via the library. And so I've done a lot of research using that myself, and you would be surprised what is in the newspaper. It's just surprising the kind of detail about certain events and people's, especially if you're looking for obituaries. People passed away. Surprisingly, some notable Indian people had obituaries in the newspaper at a time when you would think they wouldn't. So there's all kinds of gems hidden in the newspaper. Vital records, family Bibles, cemeteries. I love walking cemeteries. There's so much information in the cemetery, just based on the age of the cemetery, who's buried where, who's buried over there, who's buried over there, why they're where they're at, and who's around them. I mean, there's a wealth of information in cemeteries. And unfortunately, the thing about cemeteries, I think you have to walk them multiple times. Kind of sort of in academia, we talk about synthesizing the literature, where you sort of have to synthesize the cemetery. You kind of have to just figure out what's all there and start making those connections. Also, church records, school records, utilize national, state, and local archives. Also, network with other genealogists, because there's a wealth of information in this room. I've just been sat back and just listened to everybody talk. There's so many stories here. It's hundreds and hundreds of years of genealogy researchers right in this room. Imagine if we could spend a week or a month with each other and collaborate on projects, what all we could come up with and share. So I mean, network with other folks. And lastly, use Ancestry.com. It's a wonderful tool. Be careful. Always utilize primary sources. If you're looking at family trees that other folks have created, just kind of be careful. Check their information. Check where they get their data from, because I've seen multiple times folks cite misinformation or false or incorrect information, I should say. So just use some of those. But those are a few ways I think you can make that connection. I think most of you have already done many of these in a lot of different ways. But in 2002, I watched a movie called Gangs of New York. Some of you probably heard about it. And one of the characters in the film was Amsterdam Ballon, I think that's his last name. He was played by Leonardo DiCaprio on the left-hand side. And during the film, he said, "The past is a torch that lights our way. Where our fathers have shown us the path, we shall follow." And to me, I think oral histories are that torch that lights our path. We can use the historical record to kind of follow that path. So our ancestors have lit the way for us. Let's just use the documentary records to kind of just follow that path. So I thought that was a pretty powerful quote when I first heard it back in 2002, and it's been sitting in my genealogy notebook for 16 years now, waiting to get used, so I found a good purpose for it today. But so just kind of keep that in mind. Our ancestors have lit the way for us. It's just time for us to follow, like we've been doing. But to get back to the story of my great-great-grandmother Zilly. So when my grandfather told me this story, I started digging. I was like, who is this woman? I saw the photos of her. She was a very attractive woman. The family described her. You can see she's a beautiful woman. I like to think I got some good looks from her along the way. And that was a few generations ago. But I was able to confirm her birth, death dates, found out she was buried at St. Anna Church. So I walked the cemetery, saw where she was buried. Family members started asking around. We found out who some of her siblings were. Found out her sister was Alice, who married Demery, and that's where the Demerys got started in Robson County. Alice is buried at St. Anna, and guess who I found out was buried next to Alice? They're her parents. So Alice and Zilly's parents were buried right next to each other at St. Anna. So I got all that confirmed and started digging even more. And by the time it was over with, I had discovered that Zilly's family was Lumbee. They were from Robson County. Her father was Hitchner Locklear. Her mother was Sylvania Locklear. Her grandparents were John Locklear and Sophia Emanuel, and then Aaron Locklear and Sabra Emanuel. And you can see her line goes all the way back to Robert and Sarah Locklear, for those of you who are familiar with the Locklear line. So it's good to know my family was from here. But that didn't resolve all the questions for me. I still want to know more. Tell me about, washing hands in the clouds. And so a couple years later, I was doing some research, and somebody let me know if I'm wrong, but I think it was during the Seltzer study in the 1936, they collected oral histories from Lumbee people. And I found an oral history, and it was told by someone who was a descendant of Aaron and Sabra Emanuel. And they told the story that in the late 1830s, Aaron and Sabra had gone to the mountains of North Carolina, apparently during the time of removal. I don't know if they were there looking for land, and they heard that land was being offered, and while they were there, their son Joseph was born. And so I therefore theorized that what happened was when Aaron and Sabra came back, they didn't stay. They were actually held in a chicken coop, and Sabra's son was born while they were being held there. They came back to Robeson County. I think what happened is they washed their hands in the low-hanging clouds, and that story got passed down through the family. And so for me, that sort of helped answer that question of, oh, okay, that makes sense now why my great-great-grandmother was talking about washing hands in the clouds. Well, that's not the end of it. You know, I asked you the question earlier about, you know, why our oral history is important. Well, I had that question answered in 2007 when I was serving on the Lumbee Tribal Council. We were in DC, and there was a hearing. It was before the U.S. House Committee on Natural Resources, and it was on a bill to provide federal recognition for our people. And Chief Michelle Hicks of Eastern Band was testifying, and we all know that Eastern Band's a big fan of Lumbee. And say a few other things, but we were seated in, there were probably about as many people here as there is in the conference room as there in this middle section. And during his testimony, Chief Hicks said, he asked the question, where were Lumbees during the Trail of Tears? You know, we all know what he was trying to get at. And no lie, as soon as those words come out of his mouth, probably about 10 or 15 people behind me all sailed, and they yelled this out in the middle of the U.S. House of Representatives meeting. They yelled out, hiding in the swamps. Yep. And it was like it had been practiced before. It was the most glorious sound I'd ever heard in my life. And I was like, yeah! But the thing that how that relates to my family oral history is that most scholars and Cherokee Chief Hicks, based solely on written documentation, would argue that Lumbees were not impacted by Indian removal. However, my family's oral histories and those of distant relatives showed that Lumbees were in fact in the mountains of North Carolina in the 1830s during Indian removal. So you can see how this family story that started with my grandfather telling me about his grandmother talking about washing their hands in the clouds, by tracing the historical record, it demonstrated that Lumbee people were directly impacted by Indian removal, and that we were there and we saw what was going on. So I know that if I can connect family histories with historical documents, I know that you guys can too. It takes a little digging, it takes some chance encounters and finding some little pieces here and there, but it's something that I think is very powerful. And now when I get to tell this story and talk about Zelie and talk about the woman she was and this story that she passed down, it makes me very proud to be Lumbee and to be the great-great-grandson of her. And so I hope that through her story that I've been able to empower some of you to go and do the same thing with your family. Collect all these oral histories. Just sit down, put everybody in a room, turn on the video camera, and just record. Just let people talk and tell these great, wonderful stories. But so at this point in time, with the time that we have left, I was hoping that maybe some of you guys have some oral histories that you could share with us today. I want to tell you another one that, an oral history that I had an opportunity to research here recently, kind of to get the conversation going. I had a member of the Lumbee community approach me earlier this year, and they had heard this story that their grandfather was a business owner in Pembroke, and he was shot dead in front of his business around 1917, 1918. And they heard that his wife moved to Baltimore right afterwards, and she disappeared. And that's all they knew about the story history. Grandfather had been murdered, and the grandmother left the county. And so we started digging, looking through newspaper records, looking through census records, Ancestry.com, cemetery records, you name it. And believe it or not, I pulled up the Robesonian in 1917. There were multiple articles over a couple weeks period that talked about this Lumbee guy. Owned a business here in town. I think it was near where Fuller's Barbecue is at today. And he and his brother owned a business. And one day there was a white guy came into his business, asking him to step outside, and shot him dead on his property. As it turns out, apparently they had got into some argument about a dog or something. But continued researching and found out that this Indian guy was a pretty colorful character. And one day he had gotten drunk and was walking through Pembroke talking about Indians were going to take over Pembroke one day. And so he was an Indian radical, and you got to wonder during that time if he'd rubbed some folks the wrong way. But he was shot dead over the dog. There was a trial. Of course, the jury was all white males. And of course, the guy that killed him was found not guilty. And so the guy that did murder this gentleman, he left Robson County, never came back. The Indian business owner who was murdered, his family left for a little while. I was able to track her kids down, what happened with them, with the wife. I did find someone in Baltimore by her name, but there were probably 30 or 40 other women by that name who and many of them died about the same time. So I was never able to track her down, but it was just interesting, the information I could find about him and what happened and where he's buried at and where his parents are buried at. And we actually found a photo of him also, which was surprising in just doing this research. So it's amazing you start with a little bit of an oral history, and then there's this wealth of information out there that you just need to connect it to. So it's all possible. It's just how much digging do you want to be? It gets back to that persistence and resiliency that I talked about earlier. But I don't know if you guys have any oral histories, any details like this you want to share, Frank?
One of the oral histories in the Cooper family is that Uncle Vernon, if some of you might have heard of him before, was practiced medicine, and that he received his gift from his grandmother, Elizabeth Bessie Cooper, who at her bedside when she was passing away. But she told him that he would receive his gift once she passed, and that gift had been in our family for 500 years, and he would be the last one to have it.
Wow.
That's pretty powerful. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Frank.
So there was a lot of oral tradition and history in my family that we would go up north to visit, and a lot of Jacob's family and Brooks family would go up there. So my great-grandfather, Mr. Lacey Jacobs, son of Miss Fanny Jacobs, she married Owen Jacobs, she was Fan Brooks from the 22, would go up there, visit off from Baltimore and go up to New York. Well, then I started going up to New York on the road to go visit at socials and take their language program, and they have a community building there with a bunch of old pictures. And he's in the picture. And so I was like, well, that really happened. So that's tying it back into the historical record.
Wow.
So there was a picture of him up there. He would go up there and visit, and they actually said that he had taken some money to invest in the early construction of some of their original cookhouses.
Mine is a personal story, Lawrence, and it involves your grandmother, Zillie.
Mm-hmm.
I knew her. I had the great joy and pleasure of knowing her as a child. They lived on what is now the Faith Road, on the dirt road by the railroad track up to Reynolds Curve. And she would visit in our family. And of course, we always shared, it's a cultural thing. We always give them something to go home with, them some food. And we would give, my parents would share the food with your grandma, and she would say, and it was kind of a legend, if you will, not a legend, but the truth. Well, I do appreciate this, but could you give me a piece for Sweet William? And I can remember that. I always remember the good things of the sweet things of our childhood, those who were good to us, and of those who mistreated us. But I can remember, that is just as vivid as if it were yesterday, and of course that was I'm dating myself. But like I said, she always wanted a piece for Sweet William. So it was theirs was an endearing story. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I will add some notes to my genealogy for you. I appreciate that. Anybody else?
Ever since I was a little girl, my mom has always told me that we were part Irish, and she got this story from her father. And, I said, well, okay, so, who was this Irish person? And so so it would have been her mother's mother's mother. And the story was, she came over here as a teenager by herself, and a lady took her in, and shortly thereafter, she married, I guess that would be my great-great-grandfather, Robert Carter. I don't know if any of you come down the line, but her name was Sabrian. And so, Mama had heard that story as a little girl from her father. And so she, all her life as a young woman, she would try to ask her elders, who was Granny Sabrian. And her aunt by the time Mama, I guess, thought to ask her these questions, her aunt, she had, gone into, started with dementia. And, she said, well, Mama would ask her, well, where did she come from? And she'd say, I don't know. She had told Mama that all her life. Well, years later, whenever she had started, like I said, when the dementia started, Mama asked her, they were talking about her, and she said, oh, Granny Sadie. She said she was Irish. She said, I was always told she was Irish. So, this was a woman who had maintained for years, through Mama's life, that, she didn't know where her grandmother Sabrian had come from, but after her dementia set in, she started talking to Mama about Granny Sadie, as she called her. And it just made me wonder, well, would there be any way of trying to find her? So not long after I started working in the enrollment office, I said, well, maybe I can do some digging. So I actually found her marriage license to Robert Carter, and I thought it was interesting because her maiden name was given as Hunt. And in our official records, they weren't sure if she was a Williams or a Biggs, but on her death certificate, her mother is listed as a Rebecca Williamson. And it doesn't say anything about her, of course. So now that's kind of the dead end, but I thought that was interesting. She was given as a Hunt, and her death certificate says something else. And now I'm trying to figure out if she was even Irish at all. And that was the story that I grew up with, and so that's kind of a little thing that I'm working on, trying to figure out, well, who was Granny Sadie? Because, I was told one thing, and,
I think there's always a little fact in every story. I mean, maybe minuscule, but there's always some fact there. So, and I think, like you said, timing is key also, especially talking to certain folks. On my dad's side of the family, like I said, he was a Locklear from Marlboro County, and the way my dad's father wound up here in Robson County was so my grandfather's father was a Locklear. He was born there. He came here in the 19 teens, met a Jones lady over at the Union Chapel community, married her and took her back to Marlboro County. Well, he had they had my grandfather and my grandfather's sister. Well, the flu epidemic came along in 1918. And my family had always heard that when my grandfather's mother died, let me get started right. Yeah. So my grandfather's father died, and when they got back from the funeral, the mother and the daughter had died, and so they buried those together. And so I was able to find through death certificates and some other records that this is really what happened. But the way he wound up back in Robson County is that his mother's mother went to Marlboro County and adopted him and brought him back here to Robson County to live. So it's a little interesting. It's just, like I said, again, interesting how you can find historical records that support those oral histories that you've heard all your life. So anybody else? Any other oral histories?
I've got one, Lawrence, that kind of ties in with what Mr. Libby was talking about, the Lowrys. It's always been passed down through my family. Everybody knows of William Lowry that was killed with Allen, that was murdered. Well, in my family it says that he had a child by Mary Sampson. Mary Sampson was sister to Mariah Sampson, who was Calvin's wife, and he had a child named Henrietta, and it's always been passed down through my family. And I've never been able to find, all the records I've found that show Henrietta, it never mentions a father's, never a father's name mentioned anywhere. And I was with Miss Rosa Winfrey several years ago at an NIA conference out west somewhere, and I asked her about that, and she told me, she said, William was Henrietta's father. She was about 2 or 3 years old when he was murdered with his father, Allen. So it's interesting that it's passed down.
It's amazing, Lumbee Genealogy, how many, these outside kids connections. That's even more reason to know your genealogy, because especially when you come home and your parents or grandparents ask you, well, who's this person's people? Well, if they know these stories about these outside kids and they start making connections, they're like, you need to leave that person alone. That actually happened to me one time. It was not because there was an outside child, but I was middle school and I met this girl, you know how middle school kids are. And I came home and I was telling my grandmother about it and went back and forth for a little while and she's like, boy, that's your cousin. You know, we just started talking and you know, so there's who's your people is important for many reasons. So it's always good to know that genealogy chart and that line of descendancy.
Maybe it's time to start saying outside child and love child.
Oh, okay, my bad. Love child. Thank you. Love child.
William was never married, Lawrence. William was never married. But this Mary had a child for him. She eventually married later. Another man raised Henrietta, my great-great-grandmother. That man's name was Queenie Godwin. Are you familiar with Queenie Godwin?
Starving Godwin's been.
People say that the picture that they say is Henry Mary Lowry was actually Queenie Godwin. And Mary and Queenie are buried over at Mount Airy.
I've seen that Henrietta that you're talking about in a lot of family trees, and I guess someone from the family had recounted this story for some enrollment staff person, and it was preserved in the record. So I read the story, and it kind of, you know, made me think, like she was saying, you know, love children, you know, children that were kind of, you know, sort of cast aside as far as the family history. It kind of made me wonder, you know, if there would be a way to sort of start stitching all of this together. Because, like I said, I thought her story was so interesting because, you know, she was part of this, you know, tragic event of our people.
I've got a picture of it. It means a lot to me, that picture.
Maybe next year, Nancy, we can encourage everybody to bring photos.
Yes, and I think today,
Lots of photos.
folks did, so maybe in our next break, we can look at photos and share more. We definitely need more sharing time, I think.
Let me clarify what a love child is. It's
Okay.
not a child that's cast away that's loved. It's a child that's sired and born out of love, or an act of love.
But a lot of times these children are cast aside by the family.
But
Just like that.
Genealogy, my mother used to laugh about her grandmother. She called her Nanny. But she was Charity Austin, she was Big Jim's daughter. And they start talking about so-and-so's kin to so-and-so, and my mother said years ago the peddlers used to get off the ships, especially Greek men, and they couldn't speak good English, and they'd load up a peddler's pack with needles and little things, and they'd walk through the country. Okay, you come up to this cabin, this lady wants this pack of needles, and she don't have the 2 cent or the 1 cent. So we go in the bedroom, we take it out and trade. Months later, here pops out this kid. Don't look like nobody in the family. Nobody questions it. The mama says it's her. And you say to Grandma would always say, God, that honey is one of them Portugueses.